Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite A-lister food writers. It's about all of life through the prism of food, and this week through spice, the latest book from award-winning food writer and Cooking Books regular, Mark Diacono.
It was a joy. Discovering spices that I hadn't really played with before. You know, Ethiopian passion berries. I'm like, what the hell are they? And then you get them and go, how did I live without them? That's like, you know, living without the internet or something.
I asked him to take me back to the black and white world when Britain was just about to have its taste buds blown into a different dimension by the arrival of the supermarket.
Take you back there. So it was just me and the old man. My mum had seen the wisdom of living life away from him, which was very sensible. He was born in Sri Lanka, so spent the first 13 years of his life there, I think, and had a taste for kind of heat. You know, he absolutely loved heat. So had this Nescafe jar of chilies, had white pepper. I didn't even know there was such a thing as black pepper. You know, it was just like white pepper. And now it's quite bizarre because my daughter, you know, she's like, what do you mean there's white pepper? I'm like, then supermarkets arrived. You know, every you know, suddenly everybody stopped shopping from the place nearest down the road. It's very hard to communicate the change. You know, it was like everything you know, pasta. Everyone's going, what's pasta? What are you talking about? You know, the dawning of the duvet. You know, it's like, what do you mean we don't tuck them in? It was like so life changing, and suddenly
it's like the Wizard of Oz, isn't it? Suddenly everything becomes Technicolor.
Everything becomes Technicolor, and you think, how did we live before mixed spice? You know, or what do you mean? I can now get one of the mixed spices by itself. What do you mean? Look, yeah, ginger. What? Ginger? No, it was like everything changed.
In a sense, I mean, you know, let's not big up the supermarkets too much. You know, you and I both are not necessarily on the side of what the supermarkets have done for the world since. Mm-hmm. But at that time, it really did explode these new experiences into our lives. So from that moment, you know, living in black and white with your dad and the Nescafe jar, suddenly what happened?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because my dad wasn't a man for change. You know, that was not going to happen. You know, but I'd go and you know, my mum was like a couple of miles away, so I'd go and spend weekends with her sometimes. And we went from kind of you know, mixed spice would be on the apple pie one, you know, and then the next week it was just ginger, and it felt totally different. You know, you felt like you know, everything was pure and clean, and you could taste this really distinct loveliness that you could, you know, and then next week it might be cinnamon. So my mum was, you know, she would play a little bit with that stuff. She started using different stuff. She made this really incredible, I remember, cheese and onion pie that I was very, very attached to. In fact, when I left home, she made me a cheese and onion pie and brought it round to where I was, you know, sharing a house with friends for the first time, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, you know, and everybody's sitting around piling into this thing. But she would try different spices and that. I remember that really well. You know, she was definitely a player. You know, she would try different things in it. But it was just so that you never knew quite what was coming along next. It was quite bizarre. I mean, I'm not talking about a spice rack that's kind of, you know, you're going to be putting shelves up for. But, you know, everybody had one then that would hold maybe 8 little jars of herbs and spices, slightly too close to the oven, so it got covered in grease. You know, but that you know, even that was a revolution. Honestly, it was even that was a revolution. It felt like, you know, a world of new flavours and exoticism had come to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so interesting that your dad actually kind of obviously grew up with the real mix of spices everyday cooking, whereas your mum didn't, but she was much more interested in playing around with flavour. That kind of dichotomy must have sort of set up some questions for you as a young child. I mean, not even you would have been aware of it, but I'm very interested in how people become interested in stuff. I wonder if that was one of your early kind of consciousness prods.
I definitely think it did. You know, it was really interesting because my mum was, I think, all tied up together in lots of ways. You know, my mum was kind of, you know, had decided to live a different life, and that different life involved kind of, you know, colour and flavour and, you know, all of that stuff. And I think she felt maybe cut free, and that was part of, you know, spices felt like, they felt kind of exotic because they were obviously clearly from somewhere else, but they also felt like kind of fun. I think that's a lot of it. You know, they felt like fun in the kitchen. They were kind of dashes of exuberance that were unnecessary, but really essential as well, you know, and I really like that.
Well, I was going to quote that back at you. You say that spices are like music, painting and poetry, entirely unnecessary and utterly essential. I love that because it's so true. It's that explosion into that world of Technicolor. Why would you ever go back?
Totally that, yeah. It feels like the difference between kind of living and existing, and between, you know, kind of the light being on and the light not. You know, you can get by, but if you've got the basis of life covered, then pleasure is a very important thing.
And what I love about this book is that, you know, in Britain we have a long, rich history of spices, but it's a colonial relationship, and you don't really touch upon that too much. You say that you're not going to really touch upon it, but it gives you an opportunity to play with this sort of empty palette. And you're bringing the colours in. So you choose what to bring in. Whereas, you know, most of the places that you go to through the friends that you bring in, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, they bring the colours and they're the rich cultures that are coming with them. But it's the glory of this empty palette that you're playing with. I mean, we were kind of aware of that.
Yeah, it was really important to me, you know. I think that one of the joys of writing a food book, I think, is that you only really know so much of what you want to include when you start it, and I really like that. You know, I think before I'd written a book, I felt like there was that you needed to be the kind of world expert on this thing, and then and you got to know what you're on about. Yes, but you only discover a lot of it as you go because you're playing, and you often, you know, I would try something. Same with Herb. You know, I try something that maybe I wasn't familiar with, or I think, I wonder if that goes with that, and as with lots of joyous things, you know, a sliding door, a little moment of luck, you know, accidental comings together, and you make another leap. And it really felt like with spice that there was a kind of freedom in a way, because so little of it is, you know, British, you know, and yet the flavours are so embedded in how we eat, how we understand other cultures that... Yeah. It was, you're right, this sense of play was really important to me, while being quite aware of wanting to have some anchors from other places around the world. So it was a lot of fun, and it was really the hardest thing, I think, when I started the book, was thinking, you know, I want to put 50 or so spices in this book. How many blends am I going to have? How many recipes am I going to have? I've got to keep the waffle, as you know, I find that difficult, to you know, a pretty short level, just to cover the ground that I want to cover. But that's what I've tried to do. It's quite a challenge.
Yeah, but you take what we kind of know now, and we do have a glorious food culture, largely thanks to immigration and that ability for us to be very open-minded and play with this very empty palette that we have in this country. But, you know, dukkha and baharat and chimichurri and all those sort of things, we kind of know now. That's really lovely, but not bumbu paste and galat Dakar, which is a Tunisian five spice I've never heard of. For me, it felt like there's more playing to be done in the kitchen. You know, the immigration brings riches to our island mentality, doesn't it? And there's so much more to be done. It's very exciting. Is that kind of what you wanted to bring to us?
Absolutely that. You know, I think we can be slightly kind of hesitant when it comes to playing with flavours that we're not familiar with, maybe with combinations of flavours. You know, you were talking about the kalat daka, and it you know, that's a gorgeous Tunisian five spice, essentially, with black pepper, grains of paradise, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon stick. On the face of it, it's quite similar to other things, but it's really distinct, and it's really quite full on, and it goes so beautifully with, I don't know, dusted on roast vegetables, as it does in a plum cake or something. And it's quite a challenge if your palate is, let's say old school British, as in, you know, the sweet stuff goes after and the savoury stuff is here. You know, it's quite a thing you can really tuck into and really play with. And there's a lot of that goes on. So while there's heat in the book, there's plenty of heat in the book, there's also a lot of kind of combinations that make you go, aha, I wonder with this. So there's a lot of room for play. And for me, as the person writing it, it was a joy. Discovering spices that I hadn't really played with before. Ethiopian passion berries. I'm like, what the hell are they? And then you get them and go, how did I live without them? That's like, living without the internet or something. And that's part of the thrill, part of the joy of it is doing that. And I hope that as much as people might get ideas from the book for using things they're familiar with, I don't know, mustard, pepper, chilies, whatever, that there will be invitations here for people to go, aha, okay, I don't know what that is. I might have to buy it off the internet, but my God, when I get, geez, that's such a wonderful thing, and there are some real kind of expanders here, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've brought your friends into the playground with those spices. You've brought Mimi Ai's Burmese food, Yemisi Arabasala, her Nigerian staff, Irina Georgescu's Romanian, Samaya Osmani's Pakistani, Zuza Zak's Polish, Jose Pizarro's Spanish. I mean, even Annie Gray's 18th century English chicken curry. There's so much stuff, and the voice of all these lovely people writing about it is a real sort of invitation to bring them to the party. And that kind of we'll talk a little bit about what they bring in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of raise that issue of the story of spices. You can't talk about spices anymore without kind of mentioning the slavery and the kind of the colonial oppression and that whole story. And you choose not to go into it, but you do nod to it. And there is that whole issue of cultural authenticity as well, and cultural appropriation. I mean, just very briefly, how did you deal with that and move on?
Yeah, it's really tricky. I think it's quite a wrestling match, because I knew very early on if you're writing a book about spices, then yes, it's your book of spice, and nobody can ever write the book of spice, but it's your book of spice. But it was very important to me to represent the food cultures from around the world, the breadth and the depth of those food cultures in a way that I'm not best able to do. But to tell the story of something like spice, it felt like, okay, I could dedicate some pages to the oppressions that are related to them, the colonialization, all of these historic things that are wildly important, and they are, and I get that. But it felt like I would do that at the cost of something else. And while I nod to it, what I wanted to do really, and I felt like I would use those pages for instead, was to invite people who are so much better placed than I to represent those cultures, to represent the food culture of the places they call home. So as you say, from around the world, so there's 15 or 16 contributors, some of them you've named, and they have brought the authenticity of their culture to the book, and that's really important because that kind of communicates that, I think. And then I get to play in the spaces in between, and it's a really difficult thing because I believe we're in a very binary world these days, and I think it's really important to hold two things, to be able to hold two things that seem partly contradictory in your mind and allow them both to be true. And I think it's perfectly right that I can cook something from Southeast Asia, or I can take something from Korea and use it in a way that isn't traditional, isn't used, but also to represent the people, to allow the people from those places to be fully represented as well as I can do in a book that's written by somebody from southwest of England. So it's trying to balance those two things as well as I can.
It feels very British. I mean, all of those people live in Britain and they they write about their culture and they bring it to this great big melting pot. It's one of the best things about Britain. We live in an unstable food culture, which allows all these wonderful influences to come and for us all to play with. And you then talk about how you play with their food. The Ethiopian spice clarified butter, the nittikibe, is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
Nittikibe. And you use it on crumpets. and,
Yeah, I mean,
potatoes.
Absolutely, it's like if it's delicious, have it. Enjoy it. That would be the wrong-headed end of things if we were to say, but you can't use it like this. You've got to play, and you're right. It's interesting, isn't it? If there's one thing I regret not being able to include here are what people from particular cultures that I really tried to, Native Australian, Native American in particular spring to mind. And it wasn't for the lack of trying, it was just, that's the way it went.
Should have asked me, I could have put you in touch with some fantastic people. Let's go to your food moments to really kind of show how you're bringing all these ideas to the pot. We're going to have to start with the west coast of France, where I've just literally come back from holiday. The Mouclade. We were on the Ile de Ré. You talk about being in La Rochelle, just down the road from there. Tell me why you chose this one, and what is it about this combination of flavours that really kind of takes us to that space?
It was a real surprise, because it's gorgeous, isn't it, that coast? It's all kind of,
amazing.
Big winds and big seas and, expanse and freshness. And, that west coast of France is really quite something. It was years ago, and I was kind of heading down that way and pondering a few things, maybe we could live here one day, maybe we did. And we just went for lunch, as you do. And it was actually on Ile de Ré. It was on the Ile de Ré. And that sort of lunch that you feel compelled to indulge rather too much in both food and something very, very dry and white. There was this. I had mussels, and it had, if you're not familiar with Mouclade, it's your classic kind of white winey mussels, but there's a little mild curry powder hanging around in there, and a bit of cognac usually as well. And it was a real shock that how could this, and chatting to the people who own the restaurant, this was the classic combination. And I was thinking, well, how can it be? And the only way I could really explain it is that La Rochelle, that was a huge trade port with the East, and a gateway for a lot of spices that came by sea into Europe that way. And that must be it. But it's such a great, it's got. I don't like to hit mussels with like big chili too much, but just that little combination of mild curry in the back, it's just perfect with that cognac undertone and the white wine too. But it was a real joy. It was a real joy and a revelation, and that sense of I was trying to work it out, and while we were eating, why, and that fell into my mind.
Well, a friend of mine who used to live in French Guiana said that was the historical port for the slaves from French Guiana.
Okay.
So with the slaves came the spices. So that's a particular French Guianan spice that has probably stayed quite authentic. I don't know. You'll have to look into that one.
That's fascinating. One of the joys about spice and recipes and combinations is it's a family tree that just keeps going, and you can just keep exploring. And I love that. There's always something else fascinating about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Your second food moment, I love this one. This is the nutmeg Brandy Alexander. And I'm going to read it, because when I first read it, I misread a word, which kind of is quite crucial. So you actually write, a couple of years ago, I sat on a coach with two friends alighting here and there at various Beatles landmarks around Liverpool. I read that as a couple of years I sat on a couch with two friends alighting here and there at various Beatles landmarks, which also works. Because I just imagined you sitting there with the record player on, playing all these songs, thinking about all the Beatles memories, and still alighting on strawberry fields. But I thought this was just wonderful, because both actually leads back to the inspiration behind your writing. And you are a prolific writer, and you're always having to kind of dig deep. This is a classic example of a Mark Diacono writing inspiration moment to me. Tell us about it from your point of view.
Well, it was really bizarre, but I wasn't expecting to kind of enjoy this the Beatles tour. I thought it'd be a bit cheesy, but my friend who's Liverpudlian was like, "No, we got to do it. You'll love it." And we went, and it stopped everywhere, and it was just extraordinary in making the connection between making these four really ordinary people who did extraordinary things seem like very real people. And Strawberry Field was was a visitor. It's a visitor kind of place now. You can go to it, but it was a Salvation Army children's home that's on the back of John Lennon's auntie's house, and he would hop over the garden wall and play in Strawberry Field. And his aunt used to say, like, you know, that if they catch you, you're going to get strung up, you know, and that came out again in Strawberry Fields when he wrote, "It's nothing to get hung about. You know, there's nothing to worry about. It's all right. I'm not going to get strung up." And whenever I have a Brandy Alexanders, it really reminds me of Lennon, because it was his favourite drink. It was his favourite drink. I think he got the taste for it from Harry Nilsson in the early 70s, and they used to drink it a lot. And it's a classic kind of wonderful drink. You know, it's brandy, cream, and usually creme de cacao is in it. But I think, and there's often a little bit of nutmeg kind of sprinkled on top. But what I did was reverse the cocoa and the nutmeg. So we've got nutmeg syrup, double cream, brandy, and then cocoa on the top. And my word, it's just extraordinary. It's one of those drinks that you really can drift off to merrily from. You know, it's a kind of sipper rather than a gulper, and it's got kind of transporting powers that I'm really attached to. But I can't help but think of Lennon every time I have one.
It's a lovely, lovely food moment. I love that one. And the third one is another one of these little sort of writing inspiration moments. It's about the relationship with your dad, even though it's about the relationship with Ted, somebody else's dad. But it says so much about your relationship with your dad as well. Tell us about Ted's mojito.
Well, Ted was a friend's dad, and he was. I think everybody needs a Ted when they sort of young. You know, a friend's dad who's just. He wore life. I think I write in the book. He wore life like a Hawaiian shirt. And he was just everything was great. You know what I mean? You'd see Teddy be like, "How you doing, Teddy?" Be like, "Yeah." And he always had time for you. You know what I mean? He always had time. He always chatted to you like you were not a kid. You know, how you doing? But he would. I remember a particular time when my dad and I weren't getting on very well. I was about 14, and my friend said, "Look, hey, do you want to come with us? We're off to Butlins for Christmas." And I'm like, God, yeah, I'd walk there, anything. So we went, and it was my introduction to Ted's favourite drink. He was quite a lager drinker, but he loved a Bacardi and Coke. And you know, when you're kind of 14, you know, beer still tastes awful, but you're kind of in the lager and you know, you're really what you're trying to do is transition from pop into alcohol. And Bacardi and Coke was quite a good one for that, because it's, you know, it's like 3/4 Coca-Cola, isn't it? You know, and Bacardi, you know, Bacardi's not disagreeable to your young palate. You know, some things I like to include in every book I do, and a mojito is one of them, and a trifle or two is another. And I was playing around with tonka beans, which might not be familiar to everyone, but they've got this extraordinary kind of vanilla-y marzipan, sort of cherry stone kind of flavour that's really quite extraordinary. And I made a syrup with tonka beans and sugar and water and stuff. And I was trying to figure out a mojito, but I was thinking there's something Coca-Cola-ish in this, and it kind of got me into making then a mojito that used Coca-Cola rather than using sparkling water, and the tonka bean syrup is the sweetness rather than the sugar. So it's really got all the ingredients by kind of flavour style of a mojito. You know, it's got the sharpness of the lime, it's got mint in it, but it's got Coca-Cola rather than sparkling water. It's got tonka bean syrup rather than sugar. It's got white rum still. So it's a kind of Bacardi and Coke mojito, and it reminds me of Ted and the importance of those moments of kindness. And it really was very lovely of them to cart me off for Christmas. I mean, I sound like I'm pulling my dad to bits. We just didn't get on for quite a bit of my early life, but we got on much better towards the end of his, so things were all good in the end. But kindness is a very important thing, I think, and those little small acts can make a big difference, and he really did.
Yeah, absolutely. And you describe your relationship with your dad as oil and water, but your fourth and final food moment is about his piccalilli.
Yeah. I think this may be the case for many men, is that you grow up thinking that your dad is normal, but actually all dads are bonkers. All dads are bonkers, and you don't realise that until a certain point. So one of my dad's particular bonkersnesses was that he would only allow certain things in the house at Christmas, and I thought, as you would, why would you not? You would assume that those things that were only in the house for Christmas were therefore Christmassy, so random things, after eights, Turkish delight, things like that. I just thought they were Christmassy. And piccalilli was one of these things. And I remember being at a friend's house and he had a jar of piccalilli sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. I'm like, left over from Christmas, is it? And he was like, what are you on about? And I'm like, piccalilli, Christmas. He was like, are you mad? I was like, well, I thought piccalilli. And he was like, no, what are you talking about? And it was the first window into realising that maybe this was one of my dad's bonkersnesses, and like I say, all dads have them. Men grow up to be increasingly bonkers as time passes. And I was like, Dad, can we get some piccalilli? And he was like, no, we can't. No, it's for Christmas. I'm like, why is it? And there was not an answer, which is another dad thing, isn't it? But there was this whole list of stuff. And he would only allow it in the house at Christmas. And I don't think even he knew why. This is the scale of the bonkersness men get as they age, is even they don't know why they think something, but they're not prepared to give it up or analyse it or anything. It's just, that's the way it is.
So you've taken it and put it in the book for that reason, to keep it there all year round.
Exactly. Sod you, Dad. We're having piccalilli. I'm going to have piccalilli in August. I'm going to have it in whenever. And I do love piccalilli. Oh, man. A Scotch egg, and there is a Scotch egg recipe in the book, is not a Scotch egg without piccalilli near it. And this one's quite nice because it's a harissa version. So it's playing with the kind of classic... the classic piccalilli, just tweaking it a little, as I think we should. Let's play in the kitchen. And it's really nice. It's a really nice change on familiar piccalilli. So, yeah, easy to make and really delicious.
It's interesting that we're playing with all these different spices now. I always sort of think about, in 10 years' time, in 50 years' time, if we're still here, if we've got any soils left, what will we be eating? Be serious for a moment, or to be realistic, we are going to have massive migrant shifts. We are, because that's the way the world's going. We are going to have more and more people coming into the country with their food to keep them feeling like real people in times of chaos. It does bring riches to cultures, doesn't it? I wonder, where haven't we been yet? Is there a place in the world whose riches we haven't plundered, borrowed perhaps?
yeah. If we haven't borrowed, that's very good. So, right in this book, there are 50 spices or so in the book. I love playing in the kitchen. I love trying new things. I grow lots of different stuff. It's kind of very much in my personality to be looking for new stuff all the time. And there was still plenty here that I'm going, okay, Ethiopian passion berries are new to me. Verbena berries, never eaten them before. Wattle seed, this amazing flavour from Australia, very much traditionally used in Aboriginal culture. It's got a flavour that's somewhere between kind of toasted hazelnuts and coffee and a bit of dark chocolate. Really quite extraordinary. But that there are more things beyond. I'm just scratching around, and that's under the next layer or two. There will be more things beyond. Where they come from, it's hard to know. It's like, what am I going to listen to next that I don't know yet? But I think it's this gentle inquisitiveness, and I think one of the things I wanted out of this book was to take people's hands away from just using, say, cinnamon where you'd use it familiarly, and try using it in different directions. And I think that sense of play and adventure will extend, hopefully, and people will try the spices they're less familiar with, but also encourage us all to keep going, well, what else is there? Because that thing that seems logical, which is, if it was that great, I'd know it by now. We know that isn't true. Mulberry's been the greatest ever fruit. We can't eat it for lots of reasons, but mostly it's too delicate to reach the shops. And often this is the case. If the supermarkets can keep selling us black pepper, they don't really have any reason to be selling us other kinds of pepper, If they can sell us one or two types of chili, why would they go beyond that? Because they can, it's much better to sell us the same thing multiple times. So we need to get beyond the supermarkets. There are so many great online suppliers, but also to be inquisitive about other cooks, other books, other cultures' food, and just to dive in and play.
Thanks for listening. You can read the transcripts at gillysmith.com, where you can sign up to my newsletter. And you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at foodgillysmith, where you can keep up with all my adventures in cookery with Leiths Online. Check the show notes and on Instagram for full details of how to get Cooking the Books discounts on Leith's cookery courses. And I'll see you next week.